Organizational units and group policy objects. In this nugget, we'll be discussing organizational units and group policy objects. Organizational units are simply containers, and we'll talk about those in an upcoming whiteboard shortly here that gives us a lot more detail about what they are used for. So we'll take a look at that in just a moment, but in the meantime, let's also take a look at policies. And of course, policies and organizational units are closely intertwined. Now, I just use the word policies here, but generally in an enterprise environment, we'll use group policy objects. You can also use just policies, which would normally be considered local policies. That's not going to be in our scope. We're going to look at the bigger picture of group policy objects. And one of the big things involved in that is the scope of management. How do you know who a policy is going to apply to? Is it going to apply to just one user? Not very often. Is it going to apply to a group of users? Is it going to apply to, who is it going to apply to? A whole domain, a site? Well, we'll take a look at the scope of management there. We'll also take a look at how to block policy inheritance if necessary. Sometimes you need to go against what a policy might otherwise implement, and you need to reverse the rules, so to speak. And we'll take a look at how to block policy inheritance, as well as how to block the ability to block policy inheritance, and that's known as no override, and that prevents anybody from blocking inheritance. We'll also take a look at software installation and restrictions. Organizational units have a number of different purposes, probably the most closely intertwined with the purpose of group policy objects. But we have a number of other purposes. So let's go ahead and take a look at these. First of all, normally it's just going to be a logical collection of resources. I mean, you wouldn't just scatter miscellaneous organizational units throughout an enterprise and have a few computers here and a few computers indiscriminately there, mixed in with a few users and maybe a couple of group accounts. No, you'd probably group things together in resources such as computers, printers, maybe specific kinds of computers such as laptop computers, server computers, desktops, that kind of thing. Might also collect some into the kinds of applications they're running, such as Exchange servers, SQL servers, and the like. So you logically collect the resources, and one reason for that is because once you've collected a certain kind of a resource, you can apply certain kinds of settings within group policy. Now, let's also take a look at another reason, and that would be to substitute regional domains. And we kind of looked at that earlier. Might be useful if you're going to collapse NT4 domains into a single Active Directory domain, or to fewer Active Directory domains. Well, using this, you can migrate user accounts from old NT4 domains into simple organizational units in your new domain. And that way you still have some distinction about where those accounts came from, and that they came from the Los Angeles domain, and now they're in the Los Angeles organizational unit. Primarily, it's also for administration. Your users don't necessarily need to even know what organizational unit they're in. Most of them probably will not. The whole purpose of it is so that you can have easier administration, so you can leverage the power of group policy, and so you can have a clear structure of where your resources are. And again, that's another big part of it is group policy. A big part of that is because of inheritance, so that if you apply a group policy on a certain level of an organizational unit, it'll also apply to any child organizational units underneath that top level OU. And we also use it for purposes of delegation. And this will often be the case when you consolidate your domains. You might have fewer domain admins, but you want those former domain admins that used to have their own domain to still have full control over their user accounts, their computer accounts, all those kinds of things. And maybe you even want them to configure their own group policy objects. Well, if that's the case, you can use the delegation of control wizard to give those administrators that kind of capability. One thing you got to keep in mind is that organizational units are not for purposes of security. Now, in other NDS kind of infrastructures like NetWare, you can use an OU for security purposes the same way we use a security group in Windows Server 2003, but that's not the case here with organizational units in Windows Server 2003. Now, briefly here, let's just take a look at an example of what might be a good design for grouping your resources with organizational units. And we'll take a look later on again in our case studies, as I mentioned earlier in this series, in introducing this series. The case studies where a lot of this is going to tie together and it's all going to kind of come to light. In any case, here we have a single domain, and if it's a single location, we don't have regional organizational units that designate different cities, for example. This might be a good example of top-level organizational units. I want to divide up my users, divide up my computers, and these are just a couple of examples of organizational units that I might have underneath that. For example, here I've got administrators, and that means the IT department administrators, as well as the help desk. Now, the reason why I might divide these up into two separate things instead of just grouping everything under one organizational unit that says IT department is because I might have different requirements for my admins, and I can apply those using group policy objects. For example, administrators often, or many times, will have required smart card logons. Well, that's a group policy that you can configure. And if I apply that to all of my admins, I'll apply that GPO right here. I wouldn't want to apply it up here at the higher level at the users, because then that would apply to the help desk department as well, and they don't really need smart card logons. Also, if I wanted to restructure this a little bit to show you another example, I might just have all of this appear under the IT department. So I might have an IT department, D-E-P-T, IT department organizational unit right here. And then these would then be child organizational units underneath the IT department. Then I'd have another department over here, HR. And we would have their users, and we'd have their computers over here. So that might be another way that this could appear. Now also when it comes to separating out the computers, why did I separate out the computers into different OUs? Well, because typically workstations, laptops, and servers, we're going to have different kinds of group policy objects, again, that we might want to apply. My workstations that are pretty much always going to be static and in the building and probably always at the same desk are going to have probably separate Internet Explorer settings than my laptop users. They may have different proxy settings or something like that than my laptop users, which will typically be able to dial in from different locations and things of this nature. And then I'd have different security requirements for my servers, for example. And I might want to apply more stringent security settings there that we don't necessarily want to have on our laptops or workstations because we need them to be more user-friendly and easy to work with. Some examples also might be that we want to apply different event log settings for our servers. We want to increase the size of the event log or to log more events, such as object access to certain files. Again, that's also controlled through group policy objects. And so that's why I want to separate these out so I can apply different GPOs primarily to each one of these. Now here's another example of what might be a good organizational unit design, and sometimes people will design their OUs according to their business unit. So here I've got my admin department, and that doesn't mean my IT admin, that just means managers and people like that. I've got my sales department, and you see we've got different departments under there. Production as well. So this is another way that we will often divide up our organizational units. Well, why would we do something like this? Again, it's probably going to largely go down to things like group policy objects. For example, with sales, maybe we have a sales contact tool or some kind of contact management tool that we will use in an application. Well, we can apply that on this entire OU and have it applied down through inheritance to these other sub-OUs down here as well. Again, we'll do that probably through a group policy object. I'll also separate out sales because I might have salespeople that we want to really lock down their computers, and we want to very carefully monitor some of the things that they're doing. We want to have more stringent group policy objects, give them a standard desktop. Whereas my administrators over here in HR and in the managers department, they need more flexibility with their desktop. They need more capabilities with it. Plus, they rank higher, so they just get more of what they want. Well, with them, I would want to give a different organizational unit with less stringent group policy objects. And then we might want to really lock this down by going to the production department where yet they'll have another application that doesn't apply to either one of these other departments, and therefore we can only apply it to this OU and allow it to flow down again through inheritance. And we can really lock this one down so that they're pretty much only kiosk kind of workstations all the way down through here. Now again, this looks like good design, but it can always be changed. I mean, depending upon what your requirements are. For example, if my shipping and receiving computers are really identical in the kind of policy that they need, the kind of management that they need, the kind of administrators that administer them, and who it is that does that, well, we might just go ahead and group these together into a single organizational unit, shipping-receiving. And take all of these computer accounts and users, whatever we got down here, and move them up into just a single OU up here and get rid of this old one, and therefore kind of simplify our organizational unit structure. And then typically, we should try to simplify things as much as possible. Now, another thing you want to do is to keep your organizational unit fairly shallow. Microsoft, I have read, says you want to keep it about 10 levels deep or less. This would be 2 levels. For example, here's my first level, here's my second level. Both of these are on the second level. I don't know if I want to go 10 levels deep, though. I think that typically, if you're going past 4 or 5 levels deep, you need to take another look and see if your organizational unit design is really as efficient as it could be. You might need to go deeper, but I think that if you're going to go past 5, you really need to take a hard look at it. And this isn't a whole picture of your organizational unit structure either. I mean, there are other things that could appear here under managers for good reason. Again, if we go back to our laptops here, and we have other computers down here, these would be our desktops. Well, they might have, again, different policy settings, different requirements, so there might be another level of organizational units under here. That would make this my third level of OU. And fortunately, the good thing about organizational units is they are very easy to redesign. It's very easy to move objects back and forth using Active Directory users or computers or scripts or something like this to move things around the way you want to. And it's normally not a big drastic issue. Plus, with group policy objects in Windows Server 2003, you can use tools like the Group Policy Management Console to look at planning mode so you can see what would happen if I did move these computers into a different organizational unit and what policies would apply, and you can kind of see a what-if scenario rather than moving them and accidentally making a mistake. Now, another big issue with organizational units is the delegation of control, and we can use the delegation of control wizard to be able to allow a certain security user or security group to be able to have a certain level of control over a specific organizational unit. For example, here under the help desk, I might have a help desk security group, and we want them to have delegated control over the workstations and laptops organizational units. And what I can do there then is to go ahead and apply them to the ACL on these specific organizational units. And that's actually what the delegation of control wizard does. It's just a fancy way of adjusting the access control list. And then in conjunction with that, I can use security templates to also apply the help desk security group to restricted groups for both of these organizational units, so that it will then add the help desk security group to the local administrators group on each one of these. That way they have full control over any of those computers. And that also points out where we can have a little bit more granularity as well, because I don't want my help desk people who are, A+ certified and able to manage hardware and simple things like this and do work pretty well with Windows XP and that kind of thing, to manage my servers and manage my DHCP servers, my DNS servers and all of that. Well, if I don't delegate control over this organization unit to them, then I don't have to worry about that. So I could then be very discreet about this. Another advantage of something like the delegation of control here is as a selling point, so that if I had an old NT4 domain over here, and maybe this was my Tucson NT4 domain, then what I want to do is to collapse that into an organizational unit for Tucson up here, underneath NuggetLab.com. But the thing that I have to deal with, again, as I talked about a while ago, is the politics of this. I have to convince these domain admins here that they will still have total control over these, what are now going to be child organizations. They'll still have total control over the users, total control over the computers, and they don't have to worry about having a reduced level of authority. They really will, but on a daily basis for the kind of daily chores they do, they probably won't notice any difference. And besides the fact that we have group policy objects with organizational units, probably the second biggest selling point is the delegation of control for OUs. Now, let's take a look at the other side of things, what might be a bad design. Now, here in NuggetLab.com, I've divided up into 3 separate OUs here, parent OUs, for Phoenix, Tucson, and Bisbee. Now, that might not necessarily be a bad design. And it's probably actually going to be a good design in many instances, especially if I have different administrators or different help desk folks that are in charge of each individual respective OU through delegation of control. On the other hand, there might be something that's not so good in this design. Notice that I have under each one of these users and computers all the way through. If I've got the same help desk or the same administrators responsible for all these users and all of these computers, then what I might have created here really is just an inefficient design. Because I will have to delegate control here, then I'll delegate control here, delegate it here, 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 and I'm delegating it to the same people each time. Well, it might be more efficient if all of this stuff is the same. They require the same policies, the same applications, the same people are in charge of them, and all that kind of thing. Then it might be more efficient to actually put the users in a single container and the computers in a single container from all 3 locations, and then all I have to do is to delegate control here once, delegate control here once, instead of 6 separate times. Now, you might think to yourself, well, okay, so what if I do it 6 separate times? That's not really that big a deal. It's only going to take me another, 10 minutes out of my day to do that 6 separate times. Well, here's the issue. As soon as there's a change to the way that you have to do this, or if you have to add another new help desk security group, another user or something like that to administer this, then you have to take that person and change them 6 times and delegate them 6 times on each one of these. Or anytime you need to add a different group policy object, or you need to do a different security template. Well, again, you have to do that 6 separate times. So it's not really the first time you configure it. It's really for what comes down the pike, and it can also complicate troubleshooting because one of these might get neglected or forgotten in a change, a configuration management change, and then you might have a troubleshooting situation on your hands that's difficult to diagnose. Now, on the other hand, this could be a good design, again, depending on how you're using all of this. If I have users in Bisbee, there's a big copper mines down here in Bisbee, Arizona. That's what Bisbee is. And if they have, robotic equipment that manages all the mining equipment and all that kind of thing, and their users have different requirements, and their computers have different applications installed on them, and everything's different here, well, probably a good idea to put them in their own OU underneath Bisbee down here. And then in Tucson, where my accountants are, they all require Excel, and nobody else really needs Excel, and all of this kind of thing. Then again, I might have a good design here instead of a bad design, depending on how I'm using this. So that's one of the things you have to do is you have to really know what your business is like, what's required of your administration department in terms of administering your users and computers. Now, another potentially bad OU design might be to have a department up here at a parent OU level and then have sub-OUs for each location because Phoenix, Tucson, and Bisbee each have a marketing department. And then to think that, okay, well, marketing. Now, marketing is going to have highly restricted desktops. I'm going to have a GPO up here. It's going to be highly restricted desktop. It's going to install an application that marketing needs as well. Well, if that's the case, then every organizational unit that's a child of Phoenix or any of these other locations will also receive the highly restrictive desktop, and it will also receive that application. Well, if in accounting we don't need that application, or if we're having to end up paying more for licenses, installing applications here that we don't even need, and if they're getting desktop restrictions that don't work for the accounting department, then what we would have to do is to block policy inheritance so that accounting no longer receives any higher level group policy objects. But that blocks off all group policy objects above this level. There might be other GPOs elsewhere within this organization that will flow down and apply to accounting that we would normally need. Now we have to go back and explicitly grant or assign them to the accounting OU. So you see, we're having to really increase the level of administration we've got there. Also, anytime you have to block policy inheritance, you really need to stop and take a look at your OU design. You might need to block policy inheritance, and it might be done even in the best of designs. But if you're having to do it too much, you should always stop and look and see if your OU structure is the most efficient possible layout. Now, another option here would be possibly to do something like this. If we have such a restrictive and specialized group policy object on the marketing organizational unit, then it might be a better idea just to take this entire marketing OU, put it down here on a peer level with these other organizational units, and this will be my marketing organizational unit down here now, and then I could just apply that group policy object right here. It doesn't interfere with these other locations or their child organizational units. Also, I don't have to pay for software that's installed in accounting anymore because we don't have it installed there now since the group policy object only applies on this level. Well, we mentioned policies while we were talking about the organizational unit structure, so now let's just go ahead and address those specifically. The big thing to remember with policies, and there are many things, many checkboxes, and there's over 600 policies that you can configure, but the big thing to remember really is something that we call scope of management. And Microsoft used to abbreviate this with Windows 2000 as SDOU, or the Site, Domain, and Organizational Unit. They're really the same thing. What we'll do is we can configure a policy on the site level. So I might have a site level policy here, site policy number 1. And then that site policy would apply to this domain and all of the child organizational units that are underneath this domain. Now if I had another domain here as well, cbtnuggets.com, if you can read that, then that Site 1 policy would also apply to that domain as well. So we try to be a little bit sparing with our site policies. I'm going to have to clean that up, with our site policies, because it might inadvertently apply to other domains that other administrators might not exactly appreciate from that domain. The scope of management also applies to the order of inheritance. So first of again is the site policy. The next thing that would apply then would be a domain policy. You can configure a policy on the domain level at the same level where you already have a default domain policy that all computers in your environment read. By the way, as far as default policies go, there's also one other one, and that was the default domain controllers policy on the domain controllers container, which is actually an organizational unit. Okay, so here I might have a domain policy. Now I have a single domain policy here that I've manually configured as well. Now what's going to happen is, if these settings don't conflict, my site policy and my domain policy, if they don't conflict and they each have one setting, then I will have two configured policy settings all the way down through my entire domain within this site. However, if the site policy and the domain policy disagree with one another, then whatever is further down the hierarchy wins. Since I started with the site, the domain policy is further down the hierarchy, therefore in a conflicting policy, it would win. Now this order of inheritance in the scope of management continues on down through our organizational unit section, so that if I have an organizational unit policy here on the Phoenix level, it will apply to the Phoenix organizational unit and all of its children. If I have another policy on my Phoenix users organizational unit, it will then inherit at this level this policy from the site, this policy from the domain, this policy from the organizational unit's parent, and this policy that's linked to this specific organizational unit. And again, all the policies will be cumulative. So if all of these policies throughout this hierarchy do not disagree with one another, then we'll go ahead and inherit all of those settings. On the other hand, if on any level of this there's a disagreement, for example, on OU2, if it disagrees, well, let's just say with all of these policies, on OU2, if the policies we've configured conflict with each one of these, then OU2's policies will win over these settings higher up above. Now remember also that a group policy consists of computer configuration settings as well as user configuration settings. Most of the settings are unique to either a computer or a user configuration, but there are some settings that are repeated in both sections. For example, there's a setting for Windows Messenger. You might disable or enable Windows Messenger. So for example, on the computer settings, if I decided to disable Windows Messenger on the computer settings, and on the user side, the user configuration, I might explicitly decide to enable Windows Messenger. Now what you have to do is to understand which one of these will win. If we're running a single policy, maybe this is OU2 policy where I've got this configured. Which one of these policies wins if these conflict within the same policy? Always, always, it's the computer policy that will win over the user configuration policy. Now also remember that you do have something called block policy inheritance. Let's say on these Phoenix computers down here, we realized that there was a configuration setting in this organizational unit policy right here that we did not want to apply to Phoenix computers. So we could block policy inheritance here. Now that will effectively block that policy out right here, but it also has the effect of blocking out any other policies further up this hierarchy, including our domain policy and our site policy over here. And that might be a case where you're throwing out the proverbial baby with the bathwater. Maybe we want these settings, we just don't want this one. So what are we going to do then? If that's what you have to do, and again, anytime you block policy inheritance, you really need to look at it and see if you're really being efficient there. But if you do have to block it, then you could also manually link the domain and the site policy to this Phoenix Computers organizational unit, and you would still effectively be blocking out this organizational unit policy here. Now, there might be another situation where you don't want to use block policy inheritance. For example, users down here are highly restricted by all of these policies that keep flowing on down through. So maybe one of these users will take out an administrator of this organizational unit here, take them out to lunch, and say, hey, you know what, we're so locked down here with all these policies we've got applying. Don't you think you could do that thing we heard about where you just block policy inheritance? Well, yeah, sure, that administrator could do that. However, then what would happen is someone at a higher level would realize that that has happened and say, hey, you weren't supposed to do that. Then they would deselect the same checkbox. So then you'd have a game of ping pong going back and forth where this administrator checks it, this administrator deselects it, and so forth. Well, what you can do is to do another thing called no override, where a higher level administrator, such as a domain admin in this case, will configure no override so that even if this is checked so that it looks like you can have block policy inheritance enabled, as long as no override is set at a higher level, then they will not be able to block any policies. Now let's just go back to Active Directory users and computers here so we can kind of quickly review where we configure policies and so we can kind of get a mental image of all the things I've been talking about. By the way, you can also do this at the highest level for Active Directory sites and services. And for this, if you're going to do a site policy, which again you want to be very sparing with, don't want to use those very often, you right-click on the site and choose its properties, and then from the Group Policy tab, you start to configure the policy. In our case, we're going to typically be doing this for the most part on an organizational unit basis, although you could also do it occasionally on a domain basis. But whichever one you're going to apply it to, whichever scope of management, you simply go to the property sheet for that particular scope of management, go to the group policy. And in our case, I don't have any policies there yet, so I'll go ahead and create one. And I'll simply call this CBTN policy. And if you remember, this is the container I used to migrate accounts from an old NT4 domain. Now I'll just click on Edit to open up the Group Policy Object Editor, and we see the computer configuration and user configuration settings here. I can install software, configure security settings, under Windows settings, all different kinds of things available here, and you can familiarize yourself with some of these if you're not already familiar with them. And then you can go to Administrative Templates. Here's a good example to show you what I was talking about earlier. For the Windows Messenger settings, where I can go to the standard view so we can see things a little bit more clearly here. And then I could disable Windows Messenger so that it's not able to be run. And if I do the same setting down under User Configuration and under Administrative Templates down here, is typically where we're going to configure most, if not all, of the user's desktop environment and their visual interface. And then here I could go to the Windows Messenger settings, and here I could go to that same policy and click Enabled. Now here it's enabled, but under the computer configuration policy, it is disabled. This one will always win, once again, because it's under the computer configuration. Now, another thing we talked about a few moments ago in the diagram that I showed you is block policy inheritance and no override. Let's say that at this HR level, somebody down here has bribed an administrator or something and says, hey, you know what? We got group policies coming down that we're inheriting from up above. Any way you can block that policy inheritance. So, administrator decides to go ahead and check this box. Well, what can happen is anybody with a higher level of authority, such as a delegation of administration or of authority higher up here in this OU, or a domain admin, for example, on the domain level, they can right-click on any higher level, go to Properties, go to Group Policy, and then they can go to Options here and choose No Override and click OK. Now that they've configured No Override for this policy, it will go ahead and flow on down through even if someone on the HR level has blocked policy inheritance. Now notice that you do this on a policy-by-policy basis, or GPO basis, so that this is the only one that's going to have no override. If there's another one at nugalab.com that does not have a selected checkbox for no override, and the HR OU does have the checkbox selected for block policy inheritance, then it will effectively block the domain policy, but it will not block this policy where I've configured no override. And then also you can go to options down here as well. And when you go into options, you can disable the policy entirely if you need to. And you might do this in a troubleshooting scenario where you think a policy is really causing serious problems, but you can't get to the bottom of it quite yet. And you can also go to the properties of the GPO itself and go to its properties right here. And you can also selectively disable computer settings, and you can say yes to that, or user settings, respectively, whichever one you want to do. And why would you do that, by the way? Well, if the policy that I've configured only has user configuration settings, I could speed up processing a little bit by selecting the disable computer configuration settings. That way it never reads any of those policies and it speeds up processing. This is not really going to be effective in a smaller organization or where you're only reading 3, 4, 5 policies. But if you have a pretty deep OU structure and you're reading, 8, 10, 12 policies in a complex hierarchy, then it could possibly speed up processing a little bit for you. Now, returning to a Group Policy Object Editor here, let's take a look at the software settings. Here we could go to a software installation where using an MSI file under computer configuration, we could assign software. You cannot publish software under computer configuration, but you can assign it. And the difference is assigned software is automatically going to be installed regardless of what the user or the computer does, whereas published software requires user interaction. That's why it can't be published under computer configuration, because it has to have interaction with it, and that's something that the user has to do. So that's the only place you can publish it is right here under software settings and software installation under user configuration. But whichever location you decide to publish or assign the software, you pretty much do the same thing. You right-click and choose New Package, and then you simply browse for a specific MSI file. For example, I didn't even know I had this here, but there I've got the admin pack.msi, which will allow me to install Windows Server 2003 Administration Tools pack on a specific given system. And this might be useful for my help desk or my administrators' Windows XP computers, whichever organizational they're located in. I could create a policy for that and then assign or publish this software so that it's always available to them, to my administrators. Now, another thing you want to do with this, by the way, is you don't want to usually do this through the local file system. Actually, you never want to do this through the local file system like I currently have. What you would want to do is to browse for whatever installation files you're going to use through my network places, or you can just type in a UNC path here. Because if I use a local path, then each individual computer that reads this policy will look at their own local C:\Windows\System32, or wherever you've got that located. Where in reality, you want to point them to distribution files, probably on a network file share somewhere. Now, on the opposite end of automatically installing software, you can also configure it so that users cannot run specific software. For example, if you wanted to prevent anyone from ever being able to run, Solitaire or Calculator, any other application you want to prevent from being run, you simply go to Computer Configuration, Windows Settings, Security Settings, and then go down to Software Restriction Policies, where I am now. Right-click and choose New Software Restriction Policies, and that's all that does so far. There's no wizard or anything that pops up there. And basically what you do is you go to the security levels and you decide whether you want it to run unrestricted or disallowed. When you select disallowed, what's going to happen is it will not allow any software to run regardless of whoever that user is. Even if you're an administrator, you can't run it. However, what you could do once you've configured disallowed, and I'll just right-click and set that as the default. This could cause a problem, so I'll just do this temporarily. It'll disallow any software from being run. And then what I would do is I'd configure exceptions in the software restriction policies to allow only specific software to run, and that's what I might do for something like a kiosk. On the other hand, unrestricted, which is the default setting when you configure this initially, will allow all software to run except for any software that you explicitly configure as not allowed. And then in this case, to restrict certain software from being able to run, I'd go down to additional rules, I'd right-click, and I'd choose a new rule that I wanted to make here. For example, a new path rule, I would just type in the path to calculator, whatever application it was. You can also browse for it. And I would say that I do not want that software to run. Now, since my existing level is unrestricted, it allows all software to run except for anything that I specify in here. Now, it could also be that someone could remove that executable from one path to another, therefore bypassing that path rule. I could also do something like a new hash rule, and that would take a hash of whichever file that I find, whichever executable it is, and it would run a hash against it, and then anytime someone tries to run that specific file, regardless of its location, as long as it matches that hash, they will not be able to run it. And then I could also configure the software policy, the software restriction based upon an internet zone rule so that whether it's trusted sites or whether it's a local intranet or something like that, I could either disallow or allow it to run unrestricted either way. And finally, I could also do a new certificate rule, which also requires a little bit of programming. But I could attach a certificate to something like a specific script and allow it to run or not allow it to run. Typically, you're going to only let scripts run that also have a specific certificate rule attached to them. That way you know that they've been signed by a trusted party. In this nugget, we took a look at organizational units and group policy objects, which are closely associated with one another because your policies are typically linked to organizational units. And in this nugget, we looked at the purpose and design of our organizational units. Now, the purpose of the organizational unit is really pretty simple. It's just a container. It contains users, groups, computer accounts, things of this nature. But really understanding the purpose of it is going to be mostly borne out in the design of your OU structure. Because remember, you want the design to be so that it will simplify administration and make it easy to delegate control to other authorized parties. Now, a big part of the OU is going to be what you do for your policies, for your group policy objects. Because since you're linking them to them, you want to make sure that the order of inheritance or the scope of management is efficient. Now, sometimes there will be a weakness or some insurmountable obstacle, and you'll have to block policy inheritance or perform no override against certain policies. Which is a trump card against block policy inheritance. Then we took a look at software installation using MSI packages, as well as how to restrict certain software from being run. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.